Hello, this is Impact. I'm Yalda Hakim. Angry words at the G20 summit. Russia says the West is using blackmail to isolate it over the war in Ukraine. The US says it is unwavering in its support for Kyiv. We'll ask if there's any chance of a diplomatic solution to the fighting. Also ahead, protests in Greece at the head-on train collision, which killed at least 42. There have been resignations and court appearances, but will that be enough to end the anger? And an area of natural beauty under threat in the Philippines as a sunken tanker starts to leak oil. That's all coming up here on Impact. Welcome to the programme. We begin in India, where G20 foreign ministers are meeting. There have already been angry exchanges between Russia and the US over Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. Russia says there will be no joint declaration at the end of the summit. The US Secretary of State said the talks have been marred by the unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine. Russian officials, meanwhile, said Moscow and Beijing had agreed to oppose what they called Western blackmail and threats, but this hasn't been confirmed by China. Michael, thank you so much for bringing us up to date. Stay with us here on Impact. Still to come, this is the 5-bedroom house Harry and Meghan left behind when they moved to California. Now King Charles is taking it back. We'll ask what that means for the relationship between the royal father and son. This is Impact on BBC World News. I'm Yalda Hakim. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex have been asked to vacate their British base, Frogmore Cottage. The couple's spokesperson has confirmed they were reportedly told to leave the property by Buckingham Palace in January, days after Prince Harry published his memoir Spare. The home in the grounds of Windsor Castle had allegedly been offered to the Duke of York. Buckingham Palace is yet to comment. Our royal correspondent Sarah Campbell reports. Indeed.
Sorry, King Charles, I should say.
Yeah. Ian Lloyd, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme.
Thank you, Yalda.
We'll be back with all the latest headlines in the next few minutes. Don't go anywhere. Of course, you can get in touch with me on Twitter. I'm at BBC Yalda Hakim, but we'll be continuing the conversation around the G20, that foreign ministers meeting. We're expecting to hear from the US Secretary of State in the next half hour, so do stay with us for that. Hello, this is Impact. I'm Yalda Hakim. Angry words over Ukraine at the G20 meeting. Russia says the West is using blackmail to isolate it over the war in Ukraine. Washington says Antony Blinken spoke to his Russian counterpart for just 10 minutes. He's about to give his closing speech. We'll bring it to you live. And millions of children around the world are getting into character to celebrate World Book Day. That's all coming up here on Impact. Welcome back to the programme. We begin again in India, where G20 foreign ministers are meeting. There have already been angry exchanges between Russia and the US over Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. Russia says there will be no joint declaration at the end of the summit. The US Secretary of State said the talks have been marred by the unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine. Russian officials, meanwhile, said Moscow and Beijing had agreed to oppose what they called Western blackmail and threats, but this hasn't been confirmed by China. Well, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi called on foreign ministers to put their differences aside and find common ground. Michael Rosen, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, stay with us here on Impact. Still to come, we'll have more on the G20 in India, where Russia's invasion of Ukraine is causing quarrels between delegates. You're looking at live pictures where we're waiting for the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, to come out and give a statement. This is Impact on BBC World News. I'm Yalda Hakim. I just want to show you these live pictures coming in from Delhi, where US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is about to hold a press conference in the next few minutes after the G20 meeting of foreign ministers. And as we've been reporting here on the programme, there has been a lot of tension between Russia and the United States at this event at the G20. We can see there someone coming up. We may be expecting Secretary Blinken to appear at any minute now. But Russia has accused the West, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, of issuing blackmail and threats against other countries at this meeting in India. And the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, earlier delivered a forceful call on Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. Now, I just want to show you some live pictures from New Delhi, where US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is about to hold a press conference in the next few minutes after the G20 meeting of foreign ministers. We are expecting Antony Blinken to come out, and there really have been angry exchanges between the United States and Russia at this summit in Delhi over Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. The US Secretary of State said the talks had been marred by the unprovoked and unjustified attack, but that the West would be unwavering in its support for Kyiv. Russian officials, meanwhile, have said Moscow and Beijing had agreed to oppose what they called Western blackmails and threats, but we haven't had any confirmation from China on that. Russia has also accused the West of undermining efforts to allow grain exports despite the Russian attack, but the US countered by saying Moscow was hampering Ukrainian exports. India has really attempted to promote the G20, whose members account for 85% of the world's GDP at this forum, and wanted to focus on solving big problems. India, as the self-styled voice of the global South, it really wanted to stress the importance of powerful developing countries in that effort. And we heard earlier from Prime Minister Narendra Modi saying there are often geopolitical differences, but we have to put those differences to one side and deal with the bigger problems that we're facing in the international community at the moment. But as we've said, there have been angry exchanges between the United States and Russia, with Russia accusing the United States of blackmail and threats against other countries at that meeting of the G20 nations in the Indian capital. We are expecting Antony Blinken to deliver a message, his statement at the end of this summit, and really focus on Russia withdrawing from Ukraine. But from the statements we've heard from the Russian foreign minister, they do not seem to be backing off and have continued to use forceful language as well against the United States. We will follow the story very closely, and we'll be back in the next few minutes with all the latest headlines. Hello, this is Impact. I'm Yalda Hakim. Angry words at the G20 meeting. Russia says the West is using blackmail to isolate it over the war in Ukraine. Washington says Antony Blinken spoke to his Russian counterpart for just 10 minutes. He's about to give his closing speech. We'll bring that to you live as soon as it happens from Delhi. As Greece mourns the victims of Wednesday's train crash, the new minister promises to modernise the railways and make them safe. And a royal residence row as King Charles asks Harry and Meghan to give up the Windsor home given to them by the late Queen Elizabeth. That's all coming up here on Impact. Welcome Welcome back to the programme. We, of course, again begin in India, where G20 foreign ministers are meeting. There have already been angry exchanges between Russia and the US over Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. Russia says there will be no joint declaration at the end of the summit. The US Secretary of State said the talks have been marred by the unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine. Russian officials, meanwhile, said Moscow and Beijing had agreed to oppose what they called Western blackmail and threats, but this hasn't been confirmed by China. Well, let's just try and show you those live pictures again coming from Delhi. We are waiting for the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken to appear any minute now to give his closing remarks, and there is an expectation that he will deliver a very forceful call on Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. So as soon as Mr. Blinken comes out, we will bring that to you live. But India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi called on foreign ministers to put their differences aside and find common ground as the Ukraine war continues to dominate discussions. Have a listen. That was Daphne Tollis, a Greek journalist, speaking to us a little earlier. Stay with us. We've got lots more coming up on the programme. We'll be going live to Delhi, where we're expecting the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken to give his final speech at the G20 summit. So do stay with us for that. This is Impact on BBC World News. I'm Yalda Hakim. Russia's deputy foreign minister has accused the United States of inspecting its nuclear weapon sites to help Ukraine attack them. Sergei Ryabkov was speaking at a UN disarmament conference in Geneva. Later, he's due to address the Human Rights Council days before UN investigators publish a report on possible Russian war crimes in Ukraine. Well, let's go straight to our correspondent Imogen Folks, who joins us live from Geneva. And Imogen, we've been talking about the tensions between the foreign ministers in Delhi, but of course there are also tensions where you are between Russia and Ukraine and frankly many other countries. Danny, thank you so much for bringing us up to date there from Manchester. I just want to show you some live pictures now, again from Delhi, where the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is about to hold a press conference. We are expecting him in the next few minutes after the G20 meeting of foreign ministers. And as we've been reporting here on the programme, there have been angry exchanges between the United States and Russia at this summit in Delhi over Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. We are expecting Antony Blinken to make a statement about that as well. So do stay with us. We've got lots more coming up in the next few minutes. This is BBC World News. I'm Yalda Hakim. The headlines. Russia has accused the West of using blackmail to isolate it over the war in Ukraine at a meeting of G20 foreign ministers. Greece's new transport minister has promised to modernise his country's railway system and restore its safety. There were protests following Wednesday's head-on train crash. Demonstrators said officials had failed in their duties. A tanker that sunk in the Philippines on Tuesday had started to leak its cargo of oil, threatening to pollute nearby marine reserves. Efforts are underway to remove the liquid from the wreck of the Princess Empress. Well, Book Day is being celebrated in more than 100 countries around the world. The annual event, organised by the United Nations, is intended to change lives through a love of books and reading.
Now on BBC World News, the latest business news from across the globe. World Business Report.
India's Supreme Court launches a formal investigation into multi-billion-dollar allegations of fraud at the Adani Group. And profits drop sharply at Abercrombie & Fitch. What's been happening at the fashion retailer, which once commanded a cult following? Hello and welcome to World Business Report. I'm Tig Enright. India's Supreme Court has set up an independent panel to investigate allegations of fraud against billionaire Gautam Adani's business empire. A US-based research firm, Hindenburg, has accused Adani Group firms of stock manipulation and financial fraud in a report in January, sending the group's shares into a sharp fall, erasing billions of dollars from the valuation. The Adani Group, which denies the allegations, has welcomed the investigation. And we're going to break from business news now, take you live to Delhi, where the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is speaking at the end of the G20 summit.
Focus on solving some of the most consequential problems affecting people of our nations and the world. And let me begin by thanking our host, India. And I am absolutely convinced that you'll see that when the leaders get together one way or another.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
You're listening there to the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken holding a press conference at the end of the G20 meeting of foreign ministers in Delhi. As we've been reporting, there have been angry exchanges at that summit over Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. And the Indian hosts, we heard Narendra Modi earlier saying that disagreements should be put to one side, that there would always be divisions when it came to geopolitical issues, and that a joint statement should be made, but the disagreements also meant there was no joint statement, and that was something that Antony Blinken was addressing there. He also reiterated the United States' support for Ukraine and said that the US would always be ready to engage, just as the United States had with the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. But those divisions continue to overshadow the G20, and the war in Ukraine continued to dominate. You're looking there at some of the summit there, the Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar speaking there a little earlier as well. Let's go straight to our Barbara Plett-Usher, who joins us on the phone. And Barbara, I mean, this whole war in Ukraine has overshadowed this entire G20 summit. Barbara, thank you as always for all of your analysis there from Delhi. Now, while the diplomacy continues in Delhi, the war, of course, in Ukraine rages on, and so does the conflict on the border. President Putin has described an alleged commando infiltration into Russian territory as a terrorist act conducted by Ukraine. Earlier, the Kremlin claimed security officers were trying to eliminate Ukrainian saboteurs who'd attacked two villages in the Bryansk border region and taken hostages. Mr. Putin alleged they'd opened fire on a civilian car. A video has appeared online claiming to show members of the Ukrainian-based Russian volunteer corps outside a local clinic. Kiev has dismissed the whole story as a classic deliberate provocation by Russia. Well, with us here is our reporter Will Vernon. And Will, you're usually based out of Moscow, and I just want to know, this sort of thing, this sort of accusation by the Russians, is it common, or is this something new that we're hearing? Will, thank you so much for all of that and bringing us up to date. Stay with us here on Impact. Still to come, this is the five-bedroom house Harry and Meghan left behind when they moved to California. Now King Charles is taking it back. We'll ask what that means for the relationship between the royal father and son. This is Impact on BBC World News. I'm Yalda Hakim. Greece has appointed a new transport minister following the train crash that killed 42 people. The transport minister said he had a mandate to modernise the country's railway and restore its safety. His predecessor resigned after the disaster, saying the system wasn't fit for the 20th century. Protests erupted in the country, with many seeing the accident as one that had been waiting to happen. Some took place in Thessaloniki and the city of Larissa, near where the disaster happened on Tuesday night. Rioters also clashed with police outside the headquarters of Hellenic Train in Athens, the company responsible for maintaining Greece's railways. The government has said an independent investigation will deliver justice. 3 days of national mourning have been declared across the country following the incident. Our Europe correspondent Nick Beek sent this report. Well, that's it from me and the team here on Impact. Of course, you can get in touch with me on Twitter. I'm at BBC Yalda Hakim. Goodbye for now.
Hello there. Storm Juliet is still going to give a lot of wet weather through the course of Thursday into Friday.